This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade. And the papers want to know whose shorts you wear. Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan. I'm back. And I just was singing that song to thank Tom Woosnam for taking things over at the bar here for the last couple months while I was out of commission. Thank you, Tom, so much. You're one of my favorites. So thanks. So the flip side of that, though, is I feel like I've forgotten how to do anything here. So bear with me, our loyal fans. Let me starting there. Let me just get back in the groove by saying welcome, all of you, to the Blue Boar Tavern, to all our very, very loyal live visitors for coming in from all over the country, thank you, Ron, all over the world. We get people from Germany, Australia. I'm forgetting some. And we're brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. So everyone, welcome, find your seats, chat amongst yourselves with the chat button. Also, hello to all our future viewers on YouTube. We get people there who are immersed in the Oxfordian world, have been for decades, and we also get brand new people. So if you like it, like what you're seeing here, if you're new, click on our YouTube Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship channel. And I just want to remind you that if you'd like to participate live, look up the SOF website, look at all the information and videos there. Think about joining, at least get on our mailing list. But as many members as we can get, help spread the word for Edward de Vere, our favorite Earl, after the one who's visiting us today. Our Earl. We're going to have Dorothea, Alex, the usual gang here. But here's the return of one of our original members. Hi, Earl. You started with us 2.5 years ago.
Oh, I've been on a long break. It's so good to be back.
Oh, wonderful. And when we got the chance to get you back and you could fit it into your schedule here and tell us about an intriguing topic I know nothing about. So I'm looking forward to Hamlet as another Scottish play.
Yes.
Welcome. And there's our 2024 Oxfordian of the Year, Bonner. We're not worthy. Thank you, Alex. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Dear Dorothy
Alex.
and Phoebe will be here soon too. And then we're off to the races. But seeing you, Alex, reminds me of your maxim because I think Hamlet as a Scottish play is going to get into some deep weeds here. So let's remember Alex's maxim to remember not everyone knows as much as we do. So start with the basics and then we'll build from there. Okay. Hi, Phoebe. Hi, Dorothea.
Hello, Jonathan. Good to see you back behind the bar.
Thank you.
Welcome back,
so much.
Jonathan. You were so missed.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be back. And I'm seeing people say
Earl's
that.
here. All right, our guest star. Move from a tavern or chair to the center stage.
That's right. I give up the presidency, and this is what I get. The first.
This is what you get.
2.5 years.
I'm for a drink.
Just sit around a bar all day.
I'm ready to celebrate, believe me.
So where should we start? Does anyone have any just things you want to get off your chest or should we just go right into Earl's?
Well, I can start because of the conference that we had in Denver. As soon as I learned that we were going to have a production of Hamlet that we could see, directed by Chris Coleman, who's one of us, I thought, fabulous. I have to go back to my Hamlet research, which was 20 years ago that I gave my first paper at Concordia on Hamlet. And I realized, there's a whole new perspective I can bring to this, which is a political perspective based on the early dating that we know is likely to be a contested question, whether it's the Ur Hamlet by Thomas Kyd or in fact, Shakespeare's first rendition of Hamlet, perhaps what has come down to us as Q1, which is about half the length of what we see in the second quarto and then the folio edition. So, but we have Thomas Nash's reference to, English Seneca will afford you whole Hamlets, whole handfuls of tragical speeches from his 1589 introduction to Robert Greene's Menaphon. And that's been a contested issue regarding the dating of Hamlet, the early dating, which then allows for a political interpretation, which is what a number of scholars I've discovered along the way have done. And really my introduction to this was Eddie Jolly's article in the Oxfordian from 25 years ago in 1999 on the dating of Hamlet. in which he really exposed the whole question of that early dating and how subversive it is to traditional interpretations of the play, and how people have actually, there have been a handful of scholars that saw a political narrative, an allegory regarding the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed in 1587. And of course, that led to the Spanish Armada invasion in 1588. So maybe a 1589 Hamlet might be topical of the whole question of Mary Queen of Scots and the melodrama around her fate. So that's what I was
So that's the Scottish connection is
that is it.
Mary Queen of Scots somewhere in Hamlet.
Well, James Plumtree, writing over 200 years ago, identified a number of parallels, and he suggested that this was a critique of Mary that was a tip of the hat to Elizabeth, if you're looking at an early dating. And he said that the question of what the story is, basically Mary Queen of Scots married Henry Darnley, Lord Darnley, in 1586, and by 1587 things had begun to go south between them. Darnley had been involved in the assassination of her secretary Rizzio. Rizzio and Polonius, or Columbus, were both assassinated in the Queen's bedchamber and were both thrown into a stairwell. This is a detail that Plumtree looked at and said, well, that looks suspicious. There might be some relationship there. And then he noticed that he really was interested in the fact that Mary married the murderer of her husband, the man who was accused of it. And there was a lot of documentation around suggesting Bothwell was behind the gunpowder plot to blow up the house where Darnley was recovering from a bad rash, which is mentioned, of course, in Hamlet. He identifies that one. But then that she married 3 months later the man who was accused of being the murderer. And that was the beginning of her downfall. They got married in June. By July, she was put in prison by the Scottish lords, the Confederate lords, and forced to abdicate, and then miscarried his child, Bothwell's child. And so there was a whole melodrama that occurred, but that she married the killer of her husband, who was the King of Scotland, is the parallel that Plumtree identified. Said, well, look at that. Nobody else had much to say about that for the next 100 years until Lillian Winstanley kind of reactivated the whole political interpretation. And around 1921, I think, is when she published her story about Hamlet and the Darnley murder. And then the next year, she published one about Macbeth and the Darnley murder. And both those arguments really tied the historical documents, actually, she was able to pull out, and the text of the plays themselves, and make coherent arguments that both Hamlet and Macbeth were topical of what happened with Mary Queen of Scots.
So this is a classic example of if you have the wrong writer, then you're going to ignore a whole bunch of primary documentation that doesn't fit your guy.
And the wrong date. The traditional scholars have a very hard time accepting a 1589 Hamlet as by Shakespeare. Although Bloom, Karen Cross, I think Charles Wright, there were a handful of them that acknowledge that that's probably Shakespeare's first draft, which could be what comes down to us as Q1. So, but Winstanley went further. She actually pulled out documentation from George Buchanan's Oration and Detection, which published the famous casket letters. These were letters that Mary apparently had penned during the lead up to the assassination of her husband, with sonnets, love sonnets, and tortured, ideas about what was going down. They're dedicated to Bothwell. She didn't sign them, but it was in her handwriting, and it was held in a silver box, the so-called silver casket that ended up in the hands of the Scottish lords. They were read out in Parliament. Buchanan had them published. William Cecil was behind that. He had them translated into Scots from the original Latin, and they were part of a whole campaign against Mary Queen of Scots that Buchanan and Cecil were working. And Lord Lennox, also, who was Lord Darnley's father, hired a ballader who was a great satiric to write these long ballads about the ghost of Darnley coming back and getting revenge for his unnatural death at the hands of Bothwell. So there was this huge anti-Marian propaganda campaign that was being run by the Scottish Protestants. John Knox was involved in that. I mean, the whole collection of men that opposed her and her Catholicism was such a huge issue. In any case, Plumtree went the first step. She went the next step, found more documentation. She said, well, among other things, well, both King Hamlet and Darnley were Catholics. Well, okay. And they both were murdered in an orchard. Oh, maybe that's a detail we should take a look at. So she enhanced the narrative to include more historical parallels to what was actually in the play text itself, in both Q1 and Q2. And I've checked, and most of what she refers to is in both those quartos. So it would have been an early edition if Q1 is in fact the one that was produced in '89. And then lastly, David Bevington, who was writing in the 1960s on Tudor drama and politics, makes it very clear he totally concurs that early Hamlet was probably topical of the whole melodrama around Mary Queen of Scots and her, being put eventually into prison, and then she escapes to England and is put in the protective custody for almost 20 years before she's finally trapped in the Babington plot. And I just want to say that the one original piece that goes beyond Winstanley and Plumtree and Babington in this is the fact that I think there's a reference. It's a very funny thing, I think, if you think of what I'm calling it, it's the beer barrel bunghole theory. And that has to do with the fact that letters are very important in both the historical record and in Hamlet. In the historical record, you have the casket letters, which really convict Mary Queen of Scots. There was these commissions that met at Westminster and in York that were totally exposing Mary and publishing these things and making it really embarrassing about the casket letters. Well, in the historical way she was finally trapped in the Babington plot was that Walsingham and his agents were able to intercept messages that were concealed in a watertight wooden container slipped in through the bunghole of a beer barrel. And every week, a new barrel would go back and forth. People drank weak beer. They didn't drink water at that time. Mm-hmm. And so they were sending secret encrypted messages that were being intercepted by Walsingham and his agents. Phillips would decipher them because he had the codes to all her ciphers that they had applied out of other spies. And so she didn't know that for weeks and weeks and weeks during the Babington plot, they were intercepting these things through the beer barrel bunghole and then passing them on to Paris, where they were then sent to the Catholics who were plotting in the Babington plot, the invasion of the Spanish troops and the group of men that would assassinate Elizabeth and who would protect Mary and bring her out of captivity and all. So the documentation of that was passed through the beer barrel bunghole. And in her trial, you know that this was revealed. The Earl of Oxford sat among the 46 commissioners during a trial at Fotheringay Castle in 1586. So he would have been aware of the fact that this beer barrel bunghole transmission of messages was really where you have the documentary proof of her colluding and agreeing to the assassination attempt. So that is what put her down. That's what really brought the death sentence upon her, because she was agreeable to the execution of a conspiracy that would end up in the assassination of Elizabeth. Well, in Hamlet, and I think, okay, I'm reading this in John Guy's description. Okay, the beer barrel bunghole. Okay, that's very cool. Well, Hamlet's holding the skull of Yorick, and he says to Horatio, Alexander lived, Alexander died, Alexander turned to dust, the dust to loam. Who's to say that loam of Alexander's dust doesn't stop the beer barrel bunghole? And he makes two references to the beer barrel bunghole.
Two references.
And that one passage, I think no. Is the Earl of Oxford sharing state secret information in the text of Hamlet about how the messages were being intercepted through that beer barrel bunghole? He would have been aware of that because he sat in the trial of her. So that was the one piece I could add. That it's a humorous piece, but I think it may hold some beer, if not water. We don't know.
And the fact that he brings it up twice is like,
yes,
he didn't get it the first time here. But we keep being told there were no conspiracies back in Elizabethan times. Hey, Tom has a question. So it sounds like this has been bubbling around the edges for a while. There's an interesting non-Oxfordian book by Lillian Winstanley titled Hamlet and the Scottish Succession, which Percy Allen found at least partly convincing. So it sounds like this has been around the edges, but people don't go too deeply into it.
She has two books, one on Hamlet in 1921, and then one on Macbeth in 1922. She really saw the pattern. It's very interesting because I was reading a German scholar, a historian named Stefan Zweig. He published in 1935 a biography of Mary Queen of Scots, and it's a psychoanalytic approach to her. He was a friend of Freud's, and I think much of his writing is interpreting her motives and all this sort of stuff. But he says at one point, oh my God, she made the same mistake Gertrude made in the over hasty marriage. And then he says, the echoes of Shakespeare in Macbeth go on and on. The whole Bothwell thing seems to be based on Macbeth and the historical, records. What's going on here? He has 2 or 3 pages of it. He's not an Oxfordian or anybody that had an inkling of the authorship challenge, but he acknowledges that in his narrative, looking at the historical and then the literary parallels there. So I think both Winstanley's spot on in both those arguments about Macbeth and Hamlet, and they are linked in another way also because they are both deeply indebted to the Oresteia and particularly the Agamemnon of Aeschylus and Euripides' Orestes plays. That both of them have references that have been documented by a number of scholars, including myself, that identify Orestian narratives that end up in Hamlet and in Macbeth. And Gilbert Murray, who was a great Greek scholar, his work in 1914, I think, on Hamlet and Orestes, a study in types, it just kills it. It just shows all those parallels, and the Macbeth story also fits in the same way with the Greek drama. So they're both bound in some way as literary sources that have echoes of great Greek drama at the same time. They both have political narratives that have some parallels, according to Winstanley at least, and maybe some other scholars.
Dorothea, you look like you have thoughts
Yeah,
like almost bursting out of your head.
I'm going to quote one of my favorite people here, which is Elizabeth Wagaman, who says, "It's never just one thing with Shakespeare. It's layers and layers and layers." I'm curious, Earl. I mean, women have made bad choices in marriage. They have they have married their husbands' killers more than once. Indeed, in Hamlet, which is, the ancient root of Hamlet, Hamlet's uncle kills Hamlet's father and marries Hamlet's mother. So there's another queen that married her husband's murderer. And I'm just curious, what do these, I think it's wonderful that we're layering then contemporary facts about Mary Queen of Scots and her very unhappy set of affairs. But there are a couple of things I want to explore. And one of them is, what do these writers do with the Hamlet myth, which is older and older and older? I mean, going back to ancient times.
Right. Well, of course, most scholars, I think, indicate that, Hamlet was the source of Belforet's translation into the French.
Well, no, Belforet translated Italian, whose name, right? Okay. Bandello. So just a little word for the Italians. Foray was a translation of the Italian, and then Foray ends up doing Hamlet. Yeah.
So good to hear that. Yeah. But anyway, Shakespeare, whoever wrote this play, relied on Belforet primarily as the source. The one thing that's interesting is that there's no ghost in either of the Danish or the French sources. And in fact, in the ballad that was written to accuse Mary Queen of Scots of having married her husband's murderer, there was a ghost. It was the ghost of Darnley that had come back and lamented. And so you have the beginning of Hamlet where the ghost comes out and laments and, tells the story. You have that same theme in that Scottish ballad that was commissioned to go after Mary Queen of Scots. So you have stuff layered on.
That's the source, really.
Maybe the source. Now, the play Agamemnon, the Seneca drama, Agamemnon starts with a ghost of Thyestes coming out and then telling the story about things. So you have classical sources too.
Layers
and of course, you have supernatural beings in the Oresteia with the Furies, of course. And, so the gods show up from time to time in those Greek dramas. Anyway, you have supernatural forces in both Macbeth and Hamlet that are extraordinary, and those are also Greek elements of Greek drama. So a lot of things linking these things together. It's like a matrix, like you were saying. It's like there's more than one meaning, more than one layering. He adds the medieval narrative along with the classical narratives to create that archetypal story of the murdered king and who the murderer marries the wife, and then it goes on, to be revenged upon by the son or some other relative. So it's a common mythic archetypal pattern that goes back to the Greeks, actually, I think.
Oh, and I think throughout history, how many times have conquerors come in with large armies, wiped out the king and his army, and then to legitimate themselves, they marry the widow, right? May not be sometimes it is a brother or a relative, right?
Look at Richard III, the killer of the king,
Oh, right.
seduces Anne. You know, it's like,
Here's a question from Jens that strikes me as especially pertinent. Was the relationship of Mary, Queen of Scots, to the alleged murderer of her husband common knowledge? Meaning, could the Stratford man have known all these dirty details, or was that sort of special knowledge of higher aristocracy? Or, in other words, how would he have known this? Could he have known it?
I have a comment to make about that.
Honor.
Well, there's all these incidents that we're talking about now happened in 1567, 1568, really 1566. And the man from Stratford was only 3 to 4 years old at that point, not engaged with the court at all, and basically a child in a little market town, 3 days travel. So obviously, I don't believe it was common knowledge that would have seeped that far into the population of England. But it really did tough for a 4-year-old to learn about it. Now, how long it stayed topical?
But he was a prodigy.
Yeah. Oh, right.
He was a genius.
well, if you're the Earl of Oxford, you're 17 years old. Okay, you're at Cecil House. The casket letters are delivered. They're being passed around. They're being talked about. They're being translated and published. He's right there in the middle of all that. Okay,
exactly.
And then you have the production of Orestes, which both Marie Axton and John Kerrigan and David Bevington think were topical of this. So you have the Orestes story told in a kind of medieval mode in the Tudor interlude Orestes, which was performed at court in 1567-68. This is the part I didn't get to talk about in Denver. I didn't. Well, it was one of 7 plays performed during the Revels season, and one of the other plays was The Tragedy of the King of Scots. So you already have one play. It's going to be about what happened with the Mary Queen of Scots and Darnley and Bothwell and all that. And then maybe you have an allegorical representation in the Tudor interlude Orestes, where the son comes back and he's authorized by the nobility to go after his mother, and so he arrests her basically and has her dragged off to be executed. And then the lover, of course, is done in Aegisthus also. And then at the end, he gets to marry Hermione, the daughter of Menelaus, who had originally opposed him. And you have the vice characters and nature and duty and all these allegorical characters from the old medieval drama coming in. And you have singing in the middle of all this. And it's like a rock opera almost. So it's very entertaining at the court. But all these people like Marie Axton, who edited this wonderful edition, the Tudor Interludes, says this was topical of Mary Queen of Scots. It was very much clearly designed to attack her and favorably received by people like William Cecil, of course, but then not so favorably by the Queen, who didn't want to have her cousin executed for what she thought was maybe a setup. I mean, those letters could have been forgeries. There's no clear evidence that the forensic handwriting analysis was actually reasonably well done. So there was so much going on that it's still a controversial thing among historians whether those casket letters were actually forgeries or partial forgeries or whatever their meaning was that incriminated Mary. So, but of course in Hamlet, you have those letters that are very, very incriminating also, where Claudius obviously writes to have Hamlet executed, and that confirms his guilt, of course, all the way around. And then Hamlet writes a bunch of different letters, including ones that condemn Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So,
meaning he forges some letters.
Yeah, he forges those letters.
He's got the seal on his finger.
And writing to Claudius and saying, "I was set naked on your land." And of course, Christopher Paul basically sure that's an Oxfordian reference because he was put shirtless after the pirates got to him. Wonderful opportunities to see both the historical and personal kind of woven into this. And, if it's a 1588-89 production that was written contemporaneous, Oxford was on his annuity from 86. He was getting £1,000. Why not write a play that justifies regicide in someone that plots a treason against a loyal, murders a person? And that's what Mary Queen of Scots was, of course, accused of. And with Bothwell and filling the role of Claudius and all this sort of stuff. So whether that was part of a political, allegorical campaign as the anti-Marian documents, you have Orestes back in 67, and then Hamlet in 88, 89. And of course, Anne Cecil dies in 88 during the time of the Spanish Armada invasion. And naturally, I think the fate of Ophelia matches in some regard Anne Cecil's fate at that time. And I didn't notice all the times I read this play, I didn't note it, but that when Ophelia is falling from the willow tree into the brook that will be her fatal place, she is wearing a crownet of weeds, and a crownet is the crownet. It's a coronet, which is the crown that the Countess of Oxford, would have been wearing. So another tag that attaches to Anne Cecil comes up in that place. And I think if there's any way of redeeming a failed marriage and relationship in some regard, and acknowledging the terrible fate of someone as innocent as Ophelia and perhaps his wife Anne, that would have been in some regards an act of redemption on his part toward her. So I just think that psychologically there's some reasons to think it might have been Oxford's way of writing a lot about the family at the same time as writing about politics. Yeah.
I'm gonna disagree with you on the Anne Cecil, and
Sure.
I'll tell you why. It's interesting to me that Polonius is referred to as an kind old man by Claudius. So Claudius and Gertrude are one generation, and he is old. I happen to think that Ophelia is actually Elizabeth there, and that Hamlet is actually Southampton in that famous betrothal that didn't go on, and that Polonius is actually Cecil, who is Elizabeth Vare's grandfather. And I'll tell you another reason why I think that, because there is no other use of the name Ophelia before Hamlet. So you have an O for Oxford, and then you have the Latin word philia, filii, filii, filiam, filia. Anybody who took first year Latin knows a noun in the feminine first declension, daughter. So the name Ophelia is Oxford's daughter. So I actually see that part of the story. It's not about her mom, Anne. It's actually about the younger generation and all that advice that Polonius is giving. He's giving, yet again, endless advice, as Horambus, two-hearted, a pun on one heart, one way, which was, of course, Cecil's family motto. But again, in this layering concept and this condensing of time frames and generations, that's a layer that I think comes in from somewhere else. Because also the other thing that's it's very interesting, but James doesn't fit into the time frame. He was a tiny baby at the time his dad was murdered. He was under a year old, right? Or very close to a year old. Yeah. So the fact that, Hamlet, we talked about this before, Hamlet, he's somewhere between 16 and 22, maybe. Maybe he's in university. That meant you went earlier in those days than now, but he's a young man. He's not a baby. And so this concept of, being melancholy over your father's death, it's time condensed. And that's like another fiction of the theater.
I'm interested. What if it's Ophelia? What if it's Ophelia with a PH in the sense of like lover of the Earl of Oxford? I'm just interested in, the tragic young death. That to me, the fact that Anne Cecil dies, young and tragically seems.
She doesn't commit suicide. She doesn't commit suicide. No, she doesn't go crazy. She doesn't commit suicide. She dies of a fever and the queen and her parents.
Clarify one thing, Dorothea. You said Ophelia doesn't appear. You said something related to the name not appearing for the first time.
Yeah, it's like the first time it shows up is in
ever
Hamlet.
In history, or
I can't find it. If someone else can and I'm wrong, let me know.
So Oxford invented the name Ophelia? Huh. That is very interesting.
That's meaningful. It's got to be meaningful somehow.
Yeah, but as I said, these are all layers. It's not, it's not a train going down a single track. He didn't write this overnight, unlike the genius Stratford, who simply, dashed off the first draft of Hamlet, and there it was, perfect. We all know he worked on this probably for decades.
Well, I want to second you on that, or support you, like somebody who does creative stuff, and I know Phoebe does, and I know a lot of writers, and that's how they work. It's not all this is a one-on-one correspondence of this in my life. It's like layers of family and history and everything all sort of piles in there. J.R. Tolkien called it like a big pile of mulch that something new grows out of. But it's a big mixture of history, personal, people all
You set
jumbled
something
together.
aside for a while because you're not satisfied with it, and then you pick it up again later and add something else to it and change something.
From that point in your life, yeah.
Yep.
That's how real artists work, yeah.
There is an interesting look at, I mean, Polonius has pretty clearly been identified as the model, Burleigh as a model for Polonius. And one of the things that's very interesting if you look at the play is that the certain precepts are, of course, the tag that everybody focuses in on, that is his advice to Laertes, which is almost verbatim between Q1 and Q2. Between Q1 and Q2, he adds 4 lines, but everything else is exactly the same. So that's very unusual that he should actually just duplicate that. But the advice he gives Rinaldo, or, the Montano in Q1, twice as many lines. And he talks about the falling out. Perhaps you should say that they are falling out at tennis. He mentions a falling out of tennis in Q2. So it's very interesting that he puts so much more into his advice to the spy than he does to his own son. Twice as many lines. And I thought, people haven't noticed that. That's another way of pointing out that this man is truly a spy master, and his techniques of investigation and innuendo and all that are very subtle and very interesting. That you should look at that sort of the advice he gives, but it's twice as many lines as he gives to his own son. So it's very interesting in that regard.
Here's a comment from John. Like most characters in Hamlet, Ophelia's name's not Danish. We can guess that. It first appeared in Jacopo Sannazzaro's 1504 poem Arcadia as Ophelia with a F.
With an F.
I guess probably derived from ancient Greek, meaning benefit. So there's another thing to throw into this mix here.
Speaking of Greek, Earl, I wonder if you could just touch on something. I think you mentioned it at a talk you gave at a previous conference, but I think it's worth bringing up again. Did you say that maybe about 100 to 120 years ago, mainstream scholars seemed to be much more receptive to the idea that Shakespeare, whoever he was, or referring to the Shakespeare as Stratford Shakespeare, knew Greek, and that idea seems to have then kind of been discarded or deliberately buried for a long, long time, and now there's the beginning of a trend back toward considering that fact again. But I wonder if you could discuss that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, really, you look back in the Variorum editions, which were published around 1900, most of them, and they have historical context that go back sometimes several hundred years. So those were the things I looked at when I was doing my research on Macbeth, Hamlet, Winter's Tale, other plays like that, and recognizing that scholars writing in the 19th century were identifying thematic parallels and textual, occurrences that were unquestionably Shakespearean in some regard, dramaturgical elements like the Winter's Tale and Much Ado and the Alcestis of Euripides, and they were commonly commented upon back then. And you look at the earlier scholars, but then around 1900, everything shifted. Because about 1920, a guy named J. Thomas Looney published on the Earl of Oxford, which we know probably had greater access to and knowledge of Greek literature than the other candidate that they were defending. And so starting about that time, basically, Robert Root wrote that he referred to no Greek drama, that it had no impact whatsoever in his writing of the plays. And then by the 1950s, that gets reinforced, and then Martindale's, and then A. de Nuttall in the early 20th century edition. No, maybe there's some echoes here, but he really ate up Ovid and Plutarch, so that's where he learned his Greek drama. And that what Jonathan Bay would say, he learned Greek drama from Ovid, and then Colin Burrow, who's Oxford Don, says, no, he learned about the Greek drama from Plutarch. All by secondary, narratives. Nobody's willing to admit that they were actually primary. But then again, you have certain other scholars, Tanya Pollard, professor at Brooklyn College now, published a book called Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages as of 2017. And she really covered the box. She proved that Euripides was clearly influential in a number of Shakespeare's plays. She wouldn't go so far as to suggest Aeschylus, which would be another step, because Aeschylus was even more metaphoric in its language in the translations that were never published in England of any Aeschylus translation, even a Latin translation in England. They were all published in Paris or other European centers, Venice, among other places. And so the scholars have ignored the Greek influence systematically over the last century. And I think partly because of the challenge of the authorship question. I think it's impaired good scholarship. But there's a handful of scholars now that are acknowledging Greek influence. And I think it's deepening, as you suggest. There's a chance that the door may swing wider open. And of course, if you look at Roger Stradvater's work at Audley End.
I was thinking of that just now, the Greek notations in it.
So the Earl of Oxford is writing annotations and margins in Latin and Greek in a Greek history text of the Roman Empire that has correspondences with those commentaries with scenes from Antony, Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar. So you see it really coming together, Alex, in a completely new and unexpected way, this idea of the Greek influence and the depth of which Oxford loved the Greeks. I mean, when he was 19, he got Plutarch's Lives and the French edition, Amyot's translation. He got Plato. I mean, he got Plato and he, so I mean, in addition to the Geneva Bible and Chaucer, he also got an edition of Plato. And he was raised, of course, in households that loved the Greek drama. And Thomas Smith and Mildred Cecil were both experts in the Greek drama, and they had all the Greek drama editions in their combined libraries. So we know he was exposed to that. And he studied Greek literature. He studied the Greek Bible on Sundays, according to, scholars, and then went to the Greek church where the liturgy would have been and classical. I mean, it would have been in St. John Chrysostom, I think, was the liturgy. And then Anne Cecil got a copy of St. John Chrysostom translation at about the time that they got back together, the Earl of Oxford and I think at some point. So there are deep roots within the Greek literature. He had the Heliodorus dedicated to him by Thomas Underwood's translation, which affected a lot of comedy in the Renaissance. It was greatly influential. So he would have just really ate up the idea of reinventing a contemporary modern drama based on Greek models for the first time in 2,000 years. That's the thing that excites me. That as the author of Shakespeare, really consciously bringing back echoes from the ancient tradition that had been neglected and ignored. And now 20th century scholars are ignoring that because they're afraid of what it might imply.
What you were saying about how the history of the authorship question went as soon as Looney's book came out, right. Suddenly they start denying a bunch of stuff. And it reminded me of Martin Short used to have this character, this defensive, sweaty lawyer who's like, we don't feel threatened by Oxfordians. We're not defensive. You're defensive. I'm not defensive.
It is interesting, even considering that, like, the more that the Stratfordians need to basically like cede ground and to say things that are patently untrue in order to avoid like giving us any points at all, the weaker their argument gets. You know what I mean? Like, at a certain point, they're cutting off their nose to spite their face, and they're having to ignore so many things, retracting. Like, they're giving up so many of the facts.
They invented other options, like, co-authorship, so that he was co-authoring with people that were from the Greek tradition. Okay. So that's the backdoor way in, co-authorship with the of course, the university.
And of course, he got these books out of the library, the public library that was down on Fleet Street, right?
He borrowed them from his French Huguenot.
Borrowed them from his friend. Actually, Earl, I wanted to ask, and you may not know, but I'm curious about that. The most recent of the scholars that you mentioned, the woman who you said kind of cleared the deck. Do you know if she reads Greek? Is she going from the original? Because my bet would be the Stratfordians who are saying there's nothing to do with it. There's nothing to do with it. They are not themselves scholars of these works in Greek. That would be my guess. Is she? Do you know?
I don't believe that she read the original Greek text, but her index includes an amazing array of all the Greek translation editions into both vernacular and Latin published in various centers. Really? Okay. She has a huge, huge index on that. It's amazing the scholarship that she did in developing her arguments. And she cites me. She cites an article that I wrote on Winter's Tale. And so I did get an acknowledgement of this, but just because Shakespeare was familiar with Euripides' plays doesn't prove that the Earl of Oxford wrote the play.
No, of course it doesn't.
She has to give me a little dig. But we did correspond afterwards. I wrote her a very, very nice note, and she responded, and I would love to see her come. She's a Yale graduate, and then went off, was a Rhodes Scholar, and came back to Yale for her PhD. And since the fellowship's going to be in New Haven next year, and we expect that Roger will be there, I think Tanya Pollard should be invited to be a special guest speaker, since we're going to be right there on the Yale campus. I'm going to pitch for Tanya as a guest speaker and focus on things that Roger's been working on. It would be wonderful to hear her commentaries on that.
Well, I hope she gets a chance to watch this Blue Boar Tavern. Maybe if it goes up on YouTube, maybe we'll find her.
Send her a link.
We'll send her the
I have
link.
a couple questions here. I'm just going to jump before we get too far along. I think this is a clarification question. I'm not quite sure what it means. But Bill says, does the queen in the source material marry her brother-in-law shortly after the death of her first husband? This is going back to Hamlet. I'm not sure what source material Bill's referring to.
He might be referring to Amleth.
In 1566, Rizzio's assassinated. In 1567, Darnley's assassinated in February. In March, the Earl of Bothwell is exonerated in a false trial. I mean, it was just a setup trial. And then she marries him a month later, basically 3 months after. And of course, in Hamlet, it's 3 months after the death of King Hamlet that she marries Claudia.
So another correspondence there.
Yeah, there's a direct correspondence in terms of the time. And of course, it's just a month later that they're ended up on Carberry Hill and all her troops desert her and she's taken in shame into prison and humiliated. And I mean, her attachment to Bothwell was pathological. Of course, Bothwell escaped all the way to Norway. He was the admiral of the Scottish Navy, so he had ships and he could get away. And he managed to get to Norway, but where he was arrested by Eric Rosencrantz and then sent into prison in Denmark, and where he spent the last decade of his life in prison going crazy. So, his fate was sealed, but he was arrested by Eric Rosencrantz. I thought that was an interesting association. So anyway, the historical, it's like a soap opera of the worst tragical quality. Darnley was a narcissist and an egotist and really wanted the crown matrimonial so that he could become king no matter what happened to her, like if she died in childbirth or something like that he would become the king of Scotland. Well, he had also a claim to the English throne, so it was very doubly so. Elizabeth wanted Leicester to marry the Queen of Scots, and Leicester and the Queen of Scots said, no. And so she managed to get Darnley, and she fell madly in love with him. She was 23 and he was 19 when they got married. I mean, this is a very young romance, and their marriage lasted a year and a half before he was assassinated. And whether she colluded in that or not, what she did was she drew him from his protection in Glasgow, where he was with the Lennox family, his birth family, and brought him back to Edinburgh, where he was isolated in this little sanctuary, and that's where the weeks later the gunpowder plot exploded the building, and he was found not strangled, but he was suffocated in the orchard next to the building. So somehow he escaped the explosion, but was then subsequently murdered by the plotters. And the fact that Bothwell was the sheriff of Edinburgh and did the investigation, and then was being accused by all sorts of other parties of being colluding to make this happen. So they were looking through their fingers. That was the metaphor of not saying anything when you knew a lot. And Bothwell was finally, overwhelmed Mary with his drive, ambition. And at that point, she was so weakened. And so, I mean, depending on how you see her, but she could have been hysterical or whatever it was, but she married him. He apparently had raped her. She was possibly pregnant, so she had to be married to him. Otherwise, there would be an illegitimate child. She couldn't divorce Darnley because that would then undo King James's claim to the throne. So very complicated, and it was very much like a soap opera. And then within months, the casket letters arrive, and then you have this production of Orestes, and the English court is all against her, except Elizabeth holds back and says, no, we can't. We'll just put her in preventive custody. And for the next 20 years, that's how she lived.
This is sort of giving me flashbacks because I'm sure many people here have done the tour of Holyrood Palace. And I remember walking through Mary Queen of Scots' bedroom, and then you step out into the next room and they say, oh, and this is where he was stabbed to death. And you're like, oh, gee.
In the
history's right there for you.
Right, the blood stain on the floor, and the and the little
stairway
and the whole thing, and you're like, and those stairs you came up, that's where the body went.
Yeah, I want to, Bonner, you said something. So that was tying it in to Bill's question about their correspondences to the short period of time between the murder and the. Did you say, Bonner, that in the original Amleth source, it's a very quick marriage too? I just didn't catch that.
I'm not sure about that.
Oh, okay.
It was a quick
But
marriage.
I'm under that impression, but I'm not certain.
Okay.
One of the things that's kind of, I don't know this, but okay, she's married to Bothwell, and that is in 1567 they get married.
Yes.
But the deal, and of course, then it all falls apart, and she's in England. But the romance, the through the letters with our Duke of Norfolk begins in 1571, at which point Bothwell has now escaped to Norway. He's still living. In England, you really can't get remarried as long as your ex is still alive. Right. How did this figure in? And
I think she was
able to be married. She wasn't.
She would demand a divorce from Bothwell. She would, or it would be an annulment because it wasn't sanctified by the Catholic Church.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the Duke of Norfolk getting caught up in the Rodolphi plot and then getting arrested, and he was writing her love letters, and they were corresponding. And then, somehow he got caught up in the plotting, and then that was the end of him. And of course, the Earl of Oxford, as his cousin, was incredibly distressed by that. So the motives for him to write something incriminating Mary Queen of Scots in the late 1580s, I think, is quite strong. And I think he was fulfilling the the expectations of his annuity and creating a production that would be humiliating to someone like the Mary Queen of Scots and justify that. They were at war with Spain, and this war would go on for, 15, 16 years. And that would have a huge impact, socioeconomic impact. I mean, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots precipitated a historical crisis, and of course the bad weather saved the British fleet, and the Armada was destroyed, and so that began. But there were more Armadas that were coming, and it didn't end until King James was on the throne and negotiated the peace settlement with Spain. So it really set off a huge conflagration of war activity that was ongoing throughout the time that we expect Shakespeare was writing and producing his play. So the fact that other playwrights are putting politics in their place, the idea that Shakespeare didn't put politics in a play like Hamlet, it's ridiculous. I think this
leads to another question that's pretty insightful and strikes me, Brian, earlier. Has anyone outlined all the ways in which De Vere used ancient stories as templates to frame his own experiences in contemporary events? Because we know Shakespeare, whoever he was, used lots of ancient stories, but then layered contemporary things on them. So instead of making up stories, he was choosing older stories. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's the idea of mimetic art. And that was the highest achievement in Renaissance culture, that you could take an ancient story and integrate it with a medieval element and add some Renaissance tags and show off your literary talent by having access to all these various elements. I mean, obviously, Ovid provides a number of the narratives that are incorporated within otherwise plot elements. I mean, clearly in Titus Andronicus, a huge influence there. So you have echoes throughout the canon, maybe less so in the history plays, but certainly in the comedies and tragedies. That's all over the place.
So that was a purposeful practice of the time to show off, look, I know all these old stories, and here's how I can apply them now.
It makes them timeless too, right? It's one of the reasons that they're timeless, because they are about human nature. Human nature has not changed one whit at its core from the time of the ancients to 2024. And, that's one of the reasons these plays live and continue to be performed.
I wonder whether Edward de Vere, who obviously held, Greek and Roman antiquity in such high regard, but was obviously so patriotic in his, aims with kind of reviving English drama to rival at least Italian, commedia dell'arte. Like, I wonder if he had a vision that one day the English dramatic canon would surpass or supplant, because obviously, there's this deep cultural insecurity that's causing them to draw on all these, like the idea that Latin is what, it's better, you know what I mean? Like, it's older and it's more serious culturally than what was going on in England. So I wonder if Edward de Vere aspired to, or even imagine that English culture could surpass ancient Greece and Rome.
I agree, Phoebe, that you're going in a very good direction on this. And it goes back to a statement made by Charles V, it's often quoted, that he spoke Latin to his clergy, he spoke French to his family and friends, and he spoke German to his dogs. English was back there as this little language that people in a little island way out in the middle of nowhere, and they went around dressing up like they were really important but they went around chopping off everybody's others heads with all this court stuff that was going on. And I think that Oxford, having traveled in England, and he one of his goals was to turn English into a language that would be respected. It would be respected in France. It would be respected in Italy. It would be respected in Spain. And part of this was his incorporating all of these other stories and his fabulous mastery of the ancients, and what the Earl has put forth so well, that hasn't really been as recognized as it should have been in academia, because they're so busy trying to dumb down Shakespeare. And we're so busy showing, as Earl has done, this magnificent command that he had of all of these stories, that he's incorporating them and inundating them and just in all kinds of ways. And then Dorothea, yes, I've been layering them in with court intrigue in England and things like this. It's unbelievable. But I believe that one of his intents was, well, he was going to give England a language that they could be proud of. He was going to give them a history that they could be proud of, which he did. He succeeded in all of these ways. And that he knew what he was doing, and it was a very deliberate, concerted effort on his part. And that is why so many of these stories in Greek and Latin, and going back to the classics and more contemporaneous, Decameron and everything like that, is so interwoven into what he wrote. Do you think that is a reasonable thing, Earl?
Absolutely. And sometimes satirically so. I mean, Troilus and Cressida, clearly it depends on Homeric input. David Bevan has written quite a bit about that, the fact that books from book 22 and book 23, 24 turn up in there. They hadn't been translated or published by Chapman yet at that point. But sometimes he does it in a deconstructing way, that he turns these heroes into, bad people like Achilles, really a miserable wretch. And, so you have, him turning things on their head sometimes. At the same time, he's having a lot of fun. Well, I think it goes back to his acquiring the collected works of Plato. And then when he read the Symposium, which is about love. It's about all the very, very defining ways of love, including mentions of Alcestis. And Aristophanes has his commentaries, and so does Agathon and other Phaedrus and others. Are all giving their various descriptions of love. And at the very end of the night, at the party is winding down, Socrates is talking to Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, and Agathon, who won the tragedian competition that year, is a great playwright, should be able to write both comedies and tragedies. And I think in the 19-year-old Earl of Oxford is reading this and saying, yeah, let's try that. Let's see if we can do that. And so I do believe that throughout his lifetime, he was inspired by the Greek example and sought it out, and was surrounded by people who were cognizant of it and deeply invested in it and loved it and translated it. And so the fact that he could quietly do this, and perhaps his anonymity or pseudonymity, or, however you want to define the name Shakespeare, was a condition that was laid on him by Elizabeth back in that 1586 annuity arrangement, an unspoken, an unwritten agreement that none of these plays would bear your name, nor have any attachment to my court. So this is my condition. And I think, to me, that is a reasonable approach to thinking about the Earl of Oxford in his 40s now, writing on and on and on with that annuity backing him up, and keeping it quiet about who is running it. And then, adopting the name Shakespeare.
A comment that just came up is talking about writing great comedies and tragedies. Somebody has said, and he managed to do both at the same time, too. Maybe he was one of the first people to do, I hate when they do this, but dramedies, where he blends them so well, they're both.
Maybe this is too obvious, but it occurs to me that obviously the Earl of Oxford, like, again, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the connection between theater and civics is so striking and so obvious. And that, he thinks not just we're going to have phenomenal theater, but we're going to have a populace that's engaged with theater. And it's interesting to me because I always thought that there was a connection, obviously, between like going to see live theater as a populace and democracy. And so that's maybe like an unintended side effect of kind of a theater going, civics oriented and engaged population. I don't know, it just occurs to me.
Well, we know totalitarian dictatorships often go after theater and popular entertainment.
Or if you're a Nazi, you like Merchant of Venice very much. And if you're an Italian fascist, Julius Caesar, you know, you're going to rewrite that. But that's what Mussolini did, and then gave it to 30,000 people out there. Okay, so you can adapt Shakespeare. Even the Japanese adapted Hamlet version to a Japanese edition with the Prime Minister playing Hamlet. So you know, depending on whatever your politics are, you find a way to make Shakespeare meaningful to you on some level.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Down to being like littering the stage with bodies at the end, and they all died again.
And then they all get up and dance at the end. That's the part I've always liked.
I think he puts clues in there. I think the beer barrel bunghole is one of those little clues he drops in there.
And again,
for us.
the fact he mentions that twice, it's like, if you didn't get it the first time, beer barrel bunghole.
What's that doing in there? I mean, what other play has beer barrel bungholes represented? I don't know. So, I just thought it was pretty amusing. The other thing that suffered Darnley, and then Lillian Winstanley makes this note, is that they buried him at night and nobody came to the burial of the King of Scotland. It was a small party and it was inconspicuous in every regard. And what does Hamlet and Laertes and Ophelia all complain about, but the unceremoniously, the short, unacknowledged grief period following the death of a notable king or a counselor, or, you know, other people, Ophelia's burial being so quietly done, you know, because the risk that this was suicidal. So it's like the main burial rites is big in both historical and in Hamlet, but also it's noteworthy that this is a classical thing too, that Antigone's all about that, and the lack of burial rites is a huge issue in the Greek drama. So these are archetypal themes. And Oxford was reinventing theater in a way that is extraordinary and hasn't been matched since, in my view. So
and consciously, like you were saying, it's sort of his way of, okay, England, we're going to up our game here.
Yeah. Eddie Jolly calls it self-consciously literate construction. That you build things like that to show off quietly, and like Castiglione will tell you, sprezzatura, you don't put your name on it.
Yeah, you do.
We're almost out of time here, folks. So any final thoughts? I just want to thank Earl for making the time to show up here again. And it's like old times again. And
yay.
Well, I came prepared to spout off about this because I'm so jazzed about the new ideas that this can generate. And it's an ongoing lifetime project, this investigation that we're all involved in. So bless you all, and thank you for inviting me back so that I could share some of these little pearls with the collected company here, and carry on.
And that's it. Okay. Thank you, everyone. God, it's so good to see you again.
Thank you all.
I've missed
So
you.
good to have you back.
Yeah.
Wonderful to have Earl.
Take care, everyone, and thanks everyone for coming to visit. Bye-bye.
Bye.